Hi friends, and welcome to the online Consent Culture and Contact Improvisation Symposium. We have gathered some of the top innovators and thinkers around this important topic to share their ideas, push the conversation forward, and inspire inclusive consent-focused CI practices. Each presenter has made a video to precede the live symposium to share the essence of their ideas so you can become familiar with their thinking. We will go deeper during the live event, sharing ideas, having discussions, and experiential exercises. The following video is by Kathleen Rea, and their presentation is entitled Supporting Neurodiversity in Contact Improvisation. Enjoy.
Welcome to my presentation on neurodiversity, which is part of the Contact Improv Consent Symposium that's happening this April 2020. This is my husband, Jeff, and he'll be interviewing me today.
Hello.
Maybe you'll find out some things you don't know about me yet.
I'm sure I will. There are people, obviously, in the community who are familiar with you and your work and what you do, but for those who aren't or may not know all of your background, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background in Contact Improv and the work you've done in Consent and where this sort of all comes from.
So my background is actually in ballet, but I was never a good fit for ballet, and in my 30s, I discovered contact dance, and literally within the first half an hour of doing contact dance, it's like the sky opened up, the angels sang, and I knew I would devote the rest of my life to contact dance improvisation, which is what I have done. And my interest in consent culture comes from about 20 years ago when I started the Toronto Wednesday Contact Dance Jam. And I had some bad incidences that happened for me at contact dance jams to do with consent. And when I started the jam, I thought, I don't want these type of things to happen at my jam, or I want to lessen the risk. So I created the Toronto Wednesday Jam guidelines, which were then published online and received a lot of attention over the years because some people were very happy about my guidelines. They were very specific and really outlined what was expected at the jam. And some people were very angered by those. They felt like that type of specificity was ruining contact dance. So they were very controversial for about 18 years. And then suddenly the Me Too movement happened and my guidelines received attention again. But this time it was more positive attention, that people were seeing my guidelines and thinking, now I understand better why we need such guidelines. So it's very interesting because I went from receiving a lot of harassment about the guidelines to receiving a lot of positive feedback about the guidelines over a 20-year period. And the other piece to this story is that about 5 years ago, my son was diagnosed with high-functioning autism. And I remember sitting in the psychologist's office and she gave me this checklist of why he was diagnosed with autism. And I looked at the checklist and I'm like, yeah, I have all those, plus those, plus those, plus those. And in that moment, I realized that I probably had high functioning autism just like my son. And it was a revelation for me. So much of how I had seen my life was through the lens of psychotherapy, where I was looking at my life and what had happened to me when I was young that had caused these patterns that caused me to act in this way. And suddenly in that moment, sitting in the psychologist's office, there was this paradigm shift of, maybe I'm just born with these idiosyncrasies and these ways that I'm different. And some of the ways that I'm different make my mind work in really amazing ways, and other ways are quite painful for me. But maybe it's something that's just the way I am. And I can navigate the world better understanding that and just accepting it. And it was a real shift for me that brought a lot of joy and relaxation into my life. Also for me, in that moment, I had a son who had autism. And if I was hiding my own autism or in denial about it, what type of example would I be for him? So I kind of went forward out of that office and thought, now it's my job to talk about the experience of having autism and to research it more and to fully embrace it. Because if I can do that, I can be a real example for my son. And if I do that as well, I can educate people about neurodiversity and help create a world that will be more understanding for my son.
You were talking about our son's experiences and your experiences with autism, high-functioning autism, and autism being kind of a spectrum disorder. There are different levels to which people experience it. But then you use the phrase neurodiversity. Now, what is neurodiversity? Does that mean somebody who has autism, or can it relate to other things as well?
A person who doesn't fit in with the typical way we process life experiences. And we're talking about the sensations and social coming in towards us, and the way that person processes or relates to those things is atypical. So if you look at this, for example, that the typical reaction to light touch from someone you like is that it feels nice. Now, you know this for certain. If he does light touch on me, I immediately become nauseous. It is so unpleasant to me that it feels like physical pain. You know this for certain.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is one of my atypical reactions, where my reaction to incoming sensation or a social connection is actually the opposite of what most people experience. So someone who has a large degree of being divergent from what's neurotypical. So this is the angle we use. Someone who's neurotypical is someone who mostly has responses that are expected. And someone who's very neurologically different is someone who mostly has reactions which are different than the norm. So that's one example of one of my reactions that's very different than the norm. And super useful for me to know about, because as I have contact dances with people, or someone offers me a massage at the end of the dance, or I'm with my husband in an intimate moment, to really know clearly that I don't like that touch, and there's nothing wrong with me for that. There's nothing that's happened to me when I was young that made me not like that touch. It's just the way my brain body is wired. Is really useful information as I traverse the contact dance world and my personal relationships.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's an interesting point, that it's nothing wrong with you that you experience the world this way. But when you use the phrase like neurodiverse or neurotypical, neuroatypical, it kind of implies there's the normal way of doing it. And if you're neuroatypical, you're not normal. Like it's maybe
yes, that's so
there's
true.
Something to be fixed there.
And that's one of the education pieces that I'm trying to offer people, is that being neuroatypical, there's nothing that needs to be fixed about you. It's just the way you are in life. And there can be a really advantage to it, because you can think of things or see things in ways that neurotypical people often don't see. So it's really great that we have people in our society that are neuroatypical, because they're the ones that be like, aha, wait, I see something here that others don't. So it's really useful, and it's, if we could embrace that difference instead of trying to fix those people and make them more typical, then I think we have a world that fits more people.
Mm. So your kind of neurological differences that you've identified, how do you think those have affected you in the contact dance world?
So I take a long time to process touch. So if someone touches me for the first time, and I'll talk about this, sorry if I tell the story, but before I started dating Jeff, when I would meet someone and they would touch me in a romantic way, it literally takes me about 24 hours to process the sensation of their touch. So like 24 hours after they had held my hand or kissed me for the first time, the next day I would be like, oh, wait, I think I'm attracted to this person, or no, I'm not attracted to this person. So my processing of touch takes so long that it's very atypical. Most people, when they're touched, they know right away whether they're attracted to someone. And so this comes into play with consent, because if I'm in a dance and something goes off in the dance in terms of how consent worked out, I often can't piece that together till 24 hours later. And typically in our contact dance culture, there's often this expectation that someone's going to know right away. I often hear, well, if you didn't like it, why didn't you just tell me as it was happening? But because of my processing speed, I actually can't. So I'd like to open up the range of how people communicate in terms of what's happening in consent, and that it's okay if someone comes to you 2 days later and says, you know, I'm an introvert and it takes me a while to process things. And actually, after 2 days of thinking, I'm thinking something went off with us in terms of consent in that dance, and why don't we talk about it? And it would be really nice if that person could just be accepting of that time lag that happened, and to know that some of us might know right away, and some of us, it might take a little bit of time.
So you've experienced the differences in the way you kind of perceive the world or process the world as being things that have impacted or made things more challenging in your contact improv experience. Would you say that on average, more or less people in the contact improv world may associate more with the neurologically atypical, just the fact that they're drawn to this form of dance, this form of expression. It's not mainstream, it's not common.
So when you're looking at a community or culture, there's going to be typical responses to social cues and to sensations. And every culture is going to have a different set of those. So we have the North American culture, which has its own set. And the contact dance is a subset group of that. So most contact dancers are a little bit neurological atypical because we're attracted to contact dance. And there's something in the autism community where you talk about different sensation seekers or sensation avoiders. And most contact dancers are vestibular seekers. So vestibular means getting like compression, touch against your body, that vigorous feeling of meeting up against the world by rolling down a hill. Most contact dancers are vestibular seekers, and that's why we like to do contact dance. And so we're already a subset group, which is a little bit outside of typical. But saying that, within our subset group of contact dance, we have also set up what is considered typical behavior and atypical behavior. So in the contact dance, I would say Jeff and me agree with this because we're both highly introverted, that it seems to be more expected to have extroversion. And the introverts in contact dance, it's considered more atypical.
And it sounds to me that when it comes to maybe consent issues, people talk about putting up boundaries, and everyone's responsible for putting up their own boundaries, but it seems perhaps somebody who's more introverted, more like has social anxiety or issues, dealing with people in a different way, may have greater difficulties putting up those boundaries than somebody who's more extroverted. That example, and are there other sort of examples of how neurodiversity kind of intersect with affect consent?
Yes, there are. And first I'd like to say that there's many ways you can be neuroatypical. So Tourette's syndrome would be one of them. Autism spectrum syndrome would be one of them. ADHD can be one of them. Being extremely introverted. So even with someone who's atypical, there's a broad range of how someone can be atypical. So I just want to say that so we include this big catchment. I'll speak to that from a couple angles. First, I'll talk about my own experience. So as someone with high functioning autism, it takes a lot of energy or time, or it's hard for me to figure out exactly what the social cues are. I can do it, but I have to really work at it. So it's no surprise that when I came up with my Wednesday Jam guidelines, they were very, very specific. I say in them, you can have sensual dances, but we don't go into overt sexuality. Overt sexuality would be stimulating erogenous zones. So they're very, very specific. And I received a lot of harassment about the specificity of my guidelines. Now, come the Me Too movement, suddenly that specificity was okay, which was very nice, but it would have been nicer if earlier people had realized it's okay to be specific, because Kathleen has high-functioning autism, and so she needs that specificity, and to give people who are on the spectrum that specificity actually makes them feel safer and easier to come to a contact jam, because it's very clear guidelines about expected behaviors, so they don't have to be stressed out or spend time trying to figure it out themselves. Because sorting out those type of social cues can be hard for someone who's on the spectrum. Also, I would like to talk about being invisible. If I am invisible, it's very hard for me to stand up for myself. So what does that mean for someone who is on the neuroatypical spectrum? So if someone does an eye contact exercise in contact dance and they say this, we're going to do an eye contact exercise and we're going to gaze into each other's eyes as we dance, because the eyes are the entrance to the soul. And you're going to gaze into their eyes while you dance for the whole exercise. If someone says that, I'm not in the room, because I don't like to make constant eye contact. It actually makes me feel nauseous. And they have set up the exercise with this belief that if you can't make eye contact, you're a failure at intimacy. So I'm standing there in the room thinking, okay, so I'm a failure at intimacy. Apparently, this is the only access to the soul, which I don't have then. And there haven't been given any outs for me in the exercise. So I want to say that exercise again, and I want to frame it in a different way, which will make me feel like I'm in the room, I'm seen, and I have some options. So we're going to do an eye contact exercise. Eye contact is just one of the many ways we can communicate with someone. And for some of you, this eye contact will feel really wonderful because you like to make eye contact. For others, it might feel very uncomfortable, and that's okay because there's so much difference in the room right now. So for some of you who the eye contact might be so unpleasant that it even makes you feel nauseous, I'm going to give you some options so that you can still do the exercise. So one of the things is, let's do an example, as I'm dancing with Jeff, that I make intermittent eye contact. And I can tell Jeff that I'm going to do this beforehand, so I can still participate in the exercise, but I get a little bit of a release valve of not having to make constant eye contact. I could also tell Jeff that I'm going to do this exercise and look at his shoulder instead, or look at his ear. Mm-hmm. And this lets me know that people see that people like me are in the room. It gives me options, and it sets up the idea that eye contact is only one of the ways that we can communicate for each other. So I'm not going to stand there thinking I'm a failure at life because I don't like to make constant eye contact.
And I'm wondering, okay, so giving teachers some guidelines, but in terms of creating guidelines for a contact jam that accommodates everybody, neurotypical, neuroatypical, do you risk, because yes, if you create one set of guidelines, the neuroatypical says, well, I've got no tools. And if now your guidelines get so specific, as you mentioned, that give them the tools, are the people on the neurotypical side saying, oh, this is dumb. Why are you talking about all this stuff? I don't like these guidelines. They're too strict. They're too limiting. Do you create kind of that, by trying to accommodate everybody, do you just end up pissing off these people?
I pissed off a lot of people because of the specificity of my guidelines. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what people said. We don't need this. And I think it's okay to have some stuff that you might not need, but someone else might need. And so, yes, you don't need them, but as long as you can acknowledge that these guidelines help other people that may have a harder time sorting out social cues, then you can be like, okay, I don't need them, but let's have them anyways, because it helps that person over there join the jam in a way that they can function
And
well.
Have you found a good way to get that message across? Do you find that...
Yeah, it's a slow process, this whole education piece I do on neurodiversity in my community is part of the way I'm working to educate people about this.
Going back to talking about exercises and teachers, if somebody is teaching a contact improv workshop or a class, are there other things they can do or be aware of or address in making that class as accommodating as possible for people with neuroatypical leanings?
Yeah, I'm going to tell a couple stories of interactions I've had with teachers, and these interactions were all well-meaning, meaning the person was not out to get me. I think they just didn't have an education about neurodiversity. So one example was a big workshop, 5 days long, and typically it takes me about 3 days to sort myself out. First of all, the delay in processing touch is so long that it takes me a long time to figure out whose touch I like, who I like to dance with. It's just a slow process. So usually by the third day, I'm acting a little bit more typical. So when people first see me, they might think I'm like shy, or some people will even think I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder because of the way I am. And so I had a teacher once come up to me and say, oh, you're opening up like a flower now. It's the third day and it's so great to see you making connection and coming out of your shell. And that really offended me because I said to her, like, there's nothing wrong with me. It always takes me this long. And I'm actually perfectly on schedule and perfectly satisfied with how I've been doing with this. And I know myself well. And it was like she was congratulating me because my behavior had become closer to typical. Don't congratulate a neuroatypical when they've gotten closer to being typical, because it's can be upsetting when that happens.
Well, the teacher, it sounds like, thought they were doing a good job in terms of encouraging you and giving you positive feedback and positive support, and they probably went back saying, yeah, I really helped that student, and those exact same actions you took as being condescending on their part. It's those two different viewpoints where...
Because for me, it was like, there's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah.
This is always how much time it takes.
Yeah.
I also think that teacher was there was more a sense that everyone should be... that extroversion was the good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I started steering a little bit toward more extroversion, so if that teacher had an understanding to really honor the importance and the value of the introverts in our community, along with the important and value of extroverts, then I don't think that they would have said it to me in the same way. So again, it just comes back to educating people.
Mm-hmm.
So another story I have, I was in a class and we were asked to be in quite close contact and to mill around where there was very little space between us, and I ended up getting a lot of sweepy light brush touch, which makes me feel nauseous. And it was presented as an open-ended exercise, so there was not a frame to it. I didn't know when it was going to end. So for me, it's like I'm caught in this situation, which is very unpleasant for me. And it's not like I know it's going to end in a minute or end when the music ends. It could have lasted half an hour longer. I didn't know what was going to happen. At that point, I have the choice to really stand out as atypical and leave the group. So I stop following the frame that the teacher has set up, which people always say this to me, well, why didn't you just step out? And it can be a really hard thing to step out because people make stories about the person who steps out. They can criticize the person who steps out. Sometimes they'll look at the person and say, good for them, they're taking care of themselves. But it can be a real moment of strength to be able to say, no, this isn't working for me, I'm going to step out. So I saw that another woman had stepped out before me, and that gave me my window to step out. So I stepped out. So there was two of us not participating, and the other woman looked a little bit nauseous too, and I looked nauseous. And then in the closing circle, the teacher asked for feedback or any closing statements, and I said, I just wanted to say that exercise was challenging for me, that I have high functioning autism, I don't like light brush touch, and it was a really challenging exercise for me to stay in, and that's why I stepped out. And the teacher said, wow, I've done that exercise all around the world, and I've never had someone complain about it. And then the next thing she said is, what do you think it is about you that made that exercise hard? Do you think it's hard for you to connect to people? And I said, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just the way I am. I have high functioning autism and I don't like light brushy touch. And I said, I know that you haven't heard someone say you don't like this exercise before, but there was actually two of us that had to step out. And if we don't make room and a space for people who are atypical to be able to speak up, they won't speak up. And maybe someone hasn't said this to you because there hasn't been space made for people to speak up. And then she said, what, am I not supposed to do this exercise anymore? And I said, no, there's 101 different variations, which means you could do the same exercise, but it would made it very inviting for me to participate in. So she was really great about it. We went aside afterwards and had a really good 15-minute chat about it. And I gave her these ideas. If she had given me a frame, if she had said, we are going to do this for 2 minutes and then we're going to stop and talk about it or move on to something else, I could have been like, I can self-regulate myself through this unpleasantness for 2 minutes just to see what this exercise will do for me. So a frame would have helped. I told her she could have given opt-out options. She could have said, some of you will really love this exercise because you really like that milling about. And for others of you, it might feel not so pleasant. For those who don't like it so much, you can give yourself permission to take a little bit more space. So just those two things would have done this. I would have known who I am is seen in the room. If I am seen in the room, I have a better ability to stand up for myself and what I want or don't want. It also would have given me opt-out options. It would have recognized that not everyone is going to like it. Some people will love that exercise and some people won't. So if she had said that, and it took a lot of bravery for me to speak up. Like I remember in the circle at the end, I'm like, should I say something about not liking this exercise? If she had said that, it would have been much easier for me to speak up and just say, hey, this is what happened to me in this exercise. Isn't that interesting? I ended up having to be 2 feet further away from everyone else, but I was still able to participate. So it doesn't mean not stopping to do these exercises. There's just a way that we can make sure people feel seen and people feel invited to do the exercise in a way that works for them.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like if you did nothing else, just having a formal opt-out option at the beginning of an exercise would go a long way to making people, A, the people who are affected feel more comfortable with stepping aside, and B, I think, as you mentioned there, educating the rest of the class a little bit, and to not think that, you know, if you do choose to step with the exercise, everyone in the class turns around and looks at you and says, what's wrong with her?
Yeah.
So having that formal just, I think, gives the permission for everybody to feel a little bit more relaxed.
And also not just opt out, but change it. So still do the exercise, but make an adjustment that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and whenever I do stand out, like the stories people make up to me are often around like that I've suffered some trauma which is causing this way of being, and if I could just fix that trauma, then I'd be able to participate in the exercise. And that type of thinking doesn't work for me because I like the way I am. My uniqueness has really brought a lot into this world. It's a unique way of seeing the world. So I don't want who I am in the world to be pathologized.
Mm-hmm. And without that diversity, I think the kind of a culture forms that of like-minded people who are like, you know, if somebody has issues with standing up for themselves or putting up boundaries and they don't come back to a jam because of it, everyone else says, oh, they couldn't handle it. They couldn't hack it. They don't have what it takes. And everyone then becomes a little bit more, you know, not self-righteous maybe, but a little bit more, we're doing things the right way. That person, because they couldn't put up boundaries, can't hack it, couldn't take it.
And what happens is the group becomes more homogenous that way. If we make a situation where, like, I'll use the word microaggressions. Like, so when that teacher came up to me and congratulated me for finally opening up like a flower, or when the teacher in the room said, what is it about you and your inability to have connection that made this exercise hard, those are what I call microaggressions. They didn't mean to do it. I think it was just a lack of education. But if someone faces enough microaggressions, they often will not stay in a community. Or they'll stay but feel a sense of suffering through that. And when we have a group of people who are atypical not stay in a community, our community becomes more homogenous and gets filled with more of the typical contact dancer. And that would make me sad because I think there is such a richness in our contact dance culture if we really welcome in the people who are neurologically different than the typical contact dancer.
Mm-hmm. If I identified or suspected that I was neuroatypical and maybe wasn't comfortable with a contact jam or a class going in being kind of different, what is some advice or some tips you can give to somebody who's coming into that kind of from the outside?
I'm going to speak from personal experience. When I came to understand myself more and accepted those things in myself, it really helped me navigate the contact dance world better. Because when I would believe a teacher that there was something flawed in me because I make disorganized or fleeting eye contact, that was a pain for me, something that I felt I wasn't good enough at. When I came to understand that I make fleeting eye contact and I really like who I am, and if that's part of who I am and what makes me see the world in a unique way, then I'm good with that. Yeah. So when I hear the teacher say that thing, already I can have an understanding and I can be like, I'm not going to take that one in. That thing that might come off as a microaggression, I'm not going to take it in. And so that's really helped me. It's really helped me becoming an activist on this issue. So it really takes a lot of bravery, but I do speak up at workshops I'm at when I come face to face with a microaggression or something that's not working for me. And I find when I speak up, there's a lot of other people in the room that are like, hey, I felt the same way. Yes. And I would like to say, looking at the statistics, if you just look at the autism statistics, like 1 in 40 to 1 in 50 have diagnosable autism. And when I say diagnosable, because there's a whole range, you can have a lot of autism symptoms, but don't have enough that would make you officially have autism. And so if we make something more inviting for the person who has autism, it's going to be more inviting all the way down the spectrum. An example is acoustic accessibility. So a lot of places I've danced in have a lot of hard surfaces, and if the talking gets loud or there's music playing, it bounces off the hard surfaces and it makes a situation which is not acoustically accessible to me. Now, the solution is to put up, they even have these felt panels which have a sticker on the back, and they're white, they're very beautiful, and you just stick them on the walls. And you can make a space acoustically accessible, which would be inviting for me who has autism, but a lot of other people who use the space will be like, wow, it's so much easier to have like a group meeting in this space because the sound is not echoing and doesn't have as tinny. So when you help create a more inviting situation for someone who's neuroatypical, there's going to be benefits that go all the way down the spectrum.
That's an important point, I think. We discussed that briefly around the guidelines before, but when you kind of add accommodations for neuroatypical, that doesn't mean, and usually isn't the case, that you're taking away anything from the more neurotypical people there.
Yeah, there is something called competing access needs. So sometimes it can, and things can compete. So a competing access need is if I have autism and people with autism stim. We all stim, actually. So if you do this or tap your foot, it's called, you're adding a stimulation that is helping to calm yourself down. The thing about people who are neurologically atypical is their stims are usually atypical. So someone with autism, their stim might be whoop, 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 which could be annoying for someone who is really sound sensitive. So I'm really sound sensitive, and my son likes to make whoop, 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 stimming sounds. And so we both have autism, but we're having competing access needs. And so that's a very real thing that communities have to navigate when being more welcoming to people on the neurodiversity scale. And I don't have any easy answers about that, but just to be aware that there are competing access needs is super important, because when you come across competing access needs, you can even say, okay, wow, this is a competing access need, so let's see how we can figure this out. And what I often do with my son, I'm like, can you do the whoop whoop thing, but just at a slightly lower pitch, because high pitch sounds are harder for me. So instead of whoop whoop, he'll go whoop 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 whoop, and then suddenly I'm good. So that's an example of a negotiation that can happen in terms of competing access needs. A competing access need I have a lot of time, fan noise is super hard for me. And when I'm at Earth Dance and they turn those really loud fans on, I cannot dance anymore. But most people need the fans on because they're too hot. So we have a competing access need. There's usually always a solution. Most of the time, fans make a lot of noise because of the cage they're in. And they actually have autism-friendly fans, which have very soft blades, so they don't need a cage. And if you stick your hand in the fan actually stops and the soft blade hits up against your hand. They're the quietest fans. So, for instance, if Earth Dance got autism-friendly fans, when people get hot, turn on the fans, I can stay in the room.
For the more perhaps neurotypical person watching this, what can you say to them?
Now, 100% typical person actually does not exist. So we are all atypical in some way. So what Jeff is talking about is the person who, for the most part, fits into the culture of typical in contact dance. That for them, when they open up and are more inviting, we create a more interesting culture. And that's more interesting culture for everyone. I would say if we can include in the range of what's expected behavior, we can make that range bigger. If we can include in the contact world the value of the introverts, if we can include in the contact dance world that some people might stim or process touch in a different way or at different lengths of time, if we can open up the range, I think it helps everyone. And that makes it easier for the people who are neuroatypical to have dialogues around consent, because they are seen and they are valued in our community.